It's day 4 of Murders at Karlov Manor spoilers, and today we get one of the most ridiculous Simic finishers I've seen in a long time, and some more juice for Mono-Red in Standard, along with a bunch more, so we should probably break it down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Murders at Karlov Manor spoilers, and we have some super fun stuff to talk about today. One of my favorite new spells from the entire set, which means we should probably jump right into it. Start talking sweet new Murders at Karlov Manor cards. Before we do, 2 quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can pre-order them from our awesome sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk Murders at Karlov Manor. First up today, we have the most Brewer's Kitchen-y spell that I think I've ever seen in Doppelgang. So Doppelgang, blue, green, and triple X. It's a sorcery. It says for each of X target permanents, create X tokens that are copies of that permanent. So if we think about how this works, for 5 mana, you copy a permanent, basically, which isn't very good. That's a little bit more expensive than you can copy a single permanent for with other cards. But for 8 mana, you're going to copy 2 permanents twice, so you get 2 token copies of each of them. Let's say you get up to 11 mana. You can target 3 things and get 3 copies of each of them for 9 total new things entering the battlefield. Obviously, if you get to 14 mana, 17 mana, 20 mana, this card is probably just going to win you the game. The thing I really like about this card is it really lacks restrictions, right? You can target any permanent on the battlefield, including lands, and it's not just your permanents. You can target your opponent's permanents as well. So we have plenty of spells in Magic that can copy a permanent, a Mythos of a Luna, a replication technique, C-double. Doppelgang, like I said before, if you're casting it for 5 mana, it's a little bit below the curve for this effect. Like, you can copy a permanent for 4 mana in Magic, so you really want to be spending at least 8 mana, or preferably 11 or 14 mana on this spell. So you're going to need a lot of mana. If you want to see more direct comparisons, my first thought was, it's kind of like Mass Manipulation. That was the last really expensive double X spell that saw play in Standard, where you just like ramp a ton and then steal your opponent's entire board and use it to win the game. Doppelgang reminds me a little bit of that. If you can get up enough mana, this is probably going to win you the game. Another comparison is like Rite of Replication on steroids. I guess for exactly 9 mana, Rite of Replication might be better in some scenarios. You get 5 copies of a creature. Doppelgang for 8 mana, you're going to get 2 copies of 2 different permanents. The thing about Doppelgang is it's just so much more flexible than Rite of Replication. You can target any permanent. If you have more than 9 mana, you can cast it more times and even get more token copies. So I really like this card. I don't know how competitive it'll be. If it's going to work in Standard, you're going to need a super dedicated ramp deck. And we talked about this before. We got Kellen now, another 2 mana ramp spell. We got Topiary Stomper. So the pieces exist to just like ramp, and trust that Doppelgang is going to win you the game. Whether or not this strategy will be like super competitive, I don't know. But this card's going to do some funny things. We've seen with the Domain deck in Standard, if you want to ramp heavily, you can do it. The pieces exist to easily get up to like 11 mana super quickly. So maybe there's a deck that does that with Doppelgang, although it's a little sad that you get to 11 mana and it just gets Disdainful Stroked or whatever. That might be a bit of an issue competitively, but it's still going to be super hilarious. As far as Commander is concerned, I think Doppelgang is big enough and exciting enough that you can run this in essentially any big mana Simic deck, which is probably basically every Simic deck because Simic's so good at ramping. But if you can get up to 11 mana, 14 mana pretty consistently, which is what, probably turn 5 in a Simic deck, this card is just totally going to be worth it for value as a finisher, as like a super Rite of Replication. I'm also intrigued by the possibility of trying to combo off with this card. So here's what I'm envisioning. You're playing some big mana Simic deck. You need to go up to 13 mana, and what you need to have is a land, a Doubling Season, and an Eternal Witness effect. So what you do is you dump 11 mana into Doppelgang X3. You copy the land, you copy the Doubling Season, you copy the Eternal Witness. Normally you would get 3 of each of these, but because you already have a Doubling Season, that's going to be doubled. So you're going to get 6 new lands, 6 new Doubling Seasons for 7 total, and then 6 new Eternal Witnesses. When the Eternal Witness enters the battlefield, you get back to Doppelgang. Now you use your 6 new lands and those 2 extra lands from the 13 we had to start to copy the Eternal Witness in the land. This time though, you have 7 doubling seasons. So normally you'd get 2 lands, 2 Eternal Witnesses, but that's going to be doubled 7 times. So instead, you're going to get 128 new lands, 128 new Eternal Witnesses. At this point, you just do the most spectacular thing ever. You get back the Doppelgang. Now you have enough mana that you can cast a X equal to the number of permanents on the battlefield. You're going to get, I don't even want to, my brain cannot comprehend how many of each thing you're going to get. And you copy the Eternal Witness again, so you can just keep doing this forever. So essentially this combo would give you infinite copies of everything that's on the battlefield, not just under your control, but under your opponent's control. So this is now definitely on my Commander bucket list. I don't know how realistic it's going to be to pull this off, but if you can just do it once, it is going to be one of the most spectacular wins you have ever imagined in Commander. So Doppelgang, definitely one of the most fun cards that we have seen, spoiled from the set so far. Just how good it's going to be at 60 card play, it is really expensive. It might be more of an against the odds card, but in Commander, I think we're going to see this showing up in a lot of Simic decks and closing out the game in a really spectacular way. We also got Case of the Locked Hothouse. So this is another Case enchantment. It's 4 mana. You start off with, you may play an additional land on each of your turns. To solve it, you need 7 or more lands, which is gonna be pretty easy. Like, this is already 4 mana. You can make some extra land drops. You should solve it in a couple of turns if you want to. And then, once it's solved, you can look at the top card of your library at any time, and you can play lands and cast creatures and enchantments from the top of your library. So this card, I am really torn on. So on one hand, it's like the worst exploration ever, right? The value of extra land drops is most pronounced early in the game because that's when you probably have extra lands in hand. There's going to be games where you drop this on turn 4 and you've already played all your lands and you don't have an extra land drop to make, which is a little bit sad. The good news is the reward of this once you solve it is very, very strong. We've seen more and more of these play things off the top of your deck effects lately. They're very powerful, they're very popular, and this is on an enchantment. It's essentially like an Augur of Autumn that also lets you cast enchantments off the top of your deck, but it's not an enchantment, so it's not just going to die to a random creature wrath or a Swords to Plowshares or whatever, which is a very, very strong effect. It reminds me a little bit of like Elven Chorus. This is a card that was printed in Lord of the Rings, lets you cast creatures off the top of your deck, but also turns all your creatures into Birds of Paradises, essentially. This has seen a bit of sideboard play in Modern, in creature-heavy decks, as a way to just like churn through your deck in grindy matchups. We've also seen like Reality Chip in Standard not really take off, but it has seen some fringe play. So there's certainly uses for this. I think if you're playing this, you gotta be some sort of ramp deck probably. You really need to solve this case for it to be worth it. A 4-mana enchantment that gives you an extra land drop, not very good. But a 4-mana enchantment that gives you an extra land drop and lets you play off the top of your deck. So you sort of build your own Oracle of Moldiah where you can play 2 lands off the top of your deck each turn. And then you can also play creatures and enchantments. That is a ridiculous amount of value. So as far as Standard is concerned, I think one question is, can this show up in Domain? Domain is currently the #1 deck in Standard, and it does work well with what this card does. It ramps up to 7 really quick for Atraxa, and if you look at a Domain deck list, most of it is lands, creatures, and enchantments, honestly, because they're using Up the Beanstalk, they're using Leyline Binding, you got Top Fury Stomper, you got Atraxa, you got like 27 lands or something absurd. So you are going to be able to play a lot of stuff off the top of your deck once you get there. The question is where do you fit this? Can you cut Invasion of Zendikar? It's going to be way less consistent, getting you to Atraxa. Maybe it's a sideboard card, so I think the card's powerful. The question's going to be, where exactly does it fit in Constructed at 4 mana? As I mentioned before, the Oracle Moldiah aspect of this card is pretty exciting. Being able to not only play lands off the top of your deck, but play extra lands off the top of your deck is an inherently powerful effect, because what happens with these cards that let you play off the top of your deck is normally they fizzle when you hit 2 lands in a row, because you can only play 1 land each turn. But Case of Locked Hothouse, just like Oracle of Moldiah, gets around that, and Oracle of Moldiah is one of those cards that people just love. This card's used way more playing Commander than it probably should as a 4-mana 2/2 that was printed like more than a decade ago. So I think in Commander, people are going to play this card a lot just because they love the effect. So where can you play this in Commander? And I think the answer really is in any creature-heavy green deck, but it's actually better than that, right? Because it also lets you play enchantments off the top of your deck, and it is an enchantment, which means you can play this in like Sethis-style Enchantress decks. You can play this in just creature-y green decks like Lathril Elves or whatever. And then it's also very good in landfall decks like Omnath, where the extra land drop you get is triggering your commander and working with the theme of your deck. So I think there's actually a lot of homes for this card. So Case of the Locked Hothouse, if 4 mana, it's making me wonder, like, is it going to be good enough for the main deck in 60 card formats, or is this more of a sideboard card? That we're going to have to wait and see, but I expect we're going to see this quite a bit in Commander, where it's really powerful, being 4 mana, not a deal breaker, and players just love playing off the top of their deck. We also got Fugitive Codebreaker. This one, I think, is going to be one of the better standard cards from the set. So 2 mana, 2/1 Goblin Rogue with prowess and haste. So essentially, exactly what you want out of a mono-red style threat. Then it has Disguise of 6 mana, but its cost is reduced by 1 for each instant or sorcery card in your graveyard. So if you got a bunch of spells in your graveyard, it can be as low as 1 red mana to flip it up, and then when it's turn phase up, you discard your hand and draw 3 cards. So Fugitive Codebreaker, it's kind of like a mixture of Abbot of Carol Keep, is you can just run this out on turn 2 as a 2/1 prowess, and it even has haste, which is a really huge upside here when you think about standard mono red, mixed with kind of like a Bedlam Reveler, a weird twist on it where you're going to play it face down first and flip it face up, but still, we've seen Bedlam Reveler. It used to be a modern staple at one point, thanks to its ability to let you refill your hand and be a big prowess threat once you have a bunch of spells in your graveyard. So those are pretty good comparisons for Fugitive Codebreaker. Both of these cards have seen heavy play in standard and even in other formats, and Fugitive Codebreaker looks a lot like them. If you think about standard mono red, the deck really values haste. If you look at a mono red list, I swear like literally every single creature in mono red in standard has haste, and that's part of its power, right? Because in standard right now, there are a lot of wraths, lots of sunfalls to populate farewells. So even if your opponent wraths your board, mono red has this advantage. We're like, all right, whatever, I'll just like haste in another dork and hit you until eventually you die. Fugitive Codebreaker works perfectly with that plan. The only question is going to be, does it beat out the other options? So you're looking at the best mono-red 2-drops in standard right now: Bloodthirsty Adversary, Charming Scoundrel, Feldon Ronom Excavator, and then Pyrotechnic Performer, which is a card I was kind of hyped about a couple days ago during spoiler season. Although honestly, now that I see Fugitive Codebreaker, I'm kind of ready to cross Performer off my list of playables in mono-red in standard. I think it could still work in like a disguise deck, but Fugitive Codebreaker does basically what Pyrotechnic Performer does. It does a lot of what Bloodthirsty Adversary does, where it's a fine 2-power haste threat on turn 2, and then later in the game, if you got a bunch of mana and you got some spells in your graveyard, you can just play this face down, immediately flip it face up, and draw a bunch of cards to get the action you need to close out the game. So I think this certainly has a role in standard mono red. Maybe it's just like Fugitive Codebreaker, Bloodthirsty Adversary. Maybe those are the 2 big 2-drops. Does it beat out Charming Scoundrel? I think it probably beats out Feldon most likely, and definitely Pyrotechnic Performer. But this is a really, really good card. I don't think it can make it outside of standard. Outside of standard, disguising is just so slow. Like, I can't imagine a modern deck that's going to play a face-down 2/2 Ward 2 creature and then try to flip it up for some amount of mana. So I don't think it makes it outside of standard. Maybe it has some shot in like Pioneer Prowess or something, but even there you got Thing and Ice, you got Bedlam Reveler. Do you really need this card? But in standard, this is a very flexible 2-drop. Speaking of very flexible 2-drops, we got a weird one in Drag the Canal. So Drag the Canal is a Dimir 2-mana instant. It says create a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token, and then if a creature died this turn, you gain 2 life, you surveil 2, and you get to investigate. So this card's very interesting. If you don't have a creature die, it's essentially just a vanilla 2/2 flash creature, which isn't bad. We've seen 2/2 flash creatures with upside like Containment Priest, Archivist of Ogma, Merfolk Trickster be very good in Magic. So just being a 2/2 flash isn't the end of the world. That's still pretty good. Where this card really shines though is if you get to trigger its abilities. So let's say you're playing a removal heavy deck, and I think this works really well with 1-mana removal. In standard, Cut Down, Fatal Push in older formats, Lightning Bolt in older formats. What you really want to do is kill one of your opponent's things, and then flash this in, get a 2/2, surveil 2, gain 2, and get a clue token that's going to draw you a card in the future. When you get all of those modes, that is an absurd amount of value for 2-mana instant speed. And it also works really well with spell themed decks. So that's one of the twists of this card, is this is essentially a creature, but it's also a spell. So it's a creature you can Snapcaster back into play from your graveyard. It's a creature that's filling your graveyard with spells for Melik. It's also triggering prowess on your Monastery Spirit Fugitive Codebreaker. It's immediately putting something in the graveyard that you can use to collect evidence for Analyze the Pollen. So there's a lot of sneaky synergies when you think through this. My spell is actually a creature effect. So Drag the Canal, I think the card's good. I don't think this card's busted, although I think there's some outside chance this could actually show up in Eternal formats. Like, it's interesting enough. I just don't know if the 2/2 is big enough, but a 2/2 that does all these things, gain 2, surveil 2, investigate, that's actually kind of wild in a deck that's interested in filling the graveyard, interested at playing at instant speed. So I do think there'll be a role for Drag the Canal. It's just a very unique, weird card, so I'm not exactly sure where it fits. I can't point to one deck where I'm going to be like, okay, 4 Drag the Canals, that's what I'm starting with, it's going to be really good, but I do think there's a deck out there that's going to be able to take advantage of it. We also got some new Celestia Reanimation in Relive the Past. So 7 mana sorcery says return up to 1 target artifact card, 1 target land card, and 1 target non-aura enchantment card from your graveyard to the battlefield. They're 5/5 elemental creatures in addition to their other types. So this card is really, really weird. There's 2 ways to think about this card. So one is it's 7 mana, add 3 bodies and 15 power and toughness to the battlefield, assuming you have all of those things in your graveyard, which I expect if you're playing this card in your deck, you should have those things in the graveyard unless you get Rest in Peace or something. That's a lot of power and toughness, right? Like, that's a lot of bodies on the battlefield. The other way to think about this card is a way to reanimate your important artifacts and enchantments. I honestly think this card is pretty bad at that job. I think you want to think of this as I'm putting a bunch of bodies on the battlefield and I'm gonna try to use them to kill you, rather than I'm gonna use this to get back my omniscience and then combo off and win the game. Because in the context of I'm trying to reanimate this really powerful artifact or an enchantment, having it be a creature is actually a really big drawback. So best comparisons here reminds me the most of Dance of the Mance, actually, that can return a bunch of artifacts and enchantments from the graveyard and turn them into 4/4s. It did see some play when it was in Standard. Also, we just got Abulio's Awakening. I actually was just trying to play an Abulio's Awakening deck in Standard that was trying to reanimate one with the multiverse, and it was a really cool idea, but the problem was it kept coming back as a creature, and my opponent just kept cut downing my one with the multiverse before I could do anything cool. So I actually was kind of disappointed in it because being a creature is such a big drawback. In Standard right now, if you just want to get back that one with the multiverse, or you just want to get back that portal to Phyrexia, you're probably better off using Campus Renovation, Repair, Recharge to not put it in creature form. So again, like I was saying before, don't think of this as like reanimation as much as a thing that puts 15 power on the battlefield and hopefully you're going to win the game. So remember, you could use this. Obviously, the dream is like, I get my one with the multiverse, I get my portal of Phyrexia, I get my land into play, they're massive, they're huge, I'm going to do this awesome stuff, but then your opponent just is like, oh, Farewell, or Sunfall, or Depopulate, and you end up very, very sad because your artifacts and enchantments are in creature form and ready to die. I like to call this the Starfield of Nyx problem. Starfield of Nyx is a really, really strong card. For 5 mana, you get to reanimate an enchantment every single turn. The problem is, if you have 5 or more enchantments, all your enchantments become creatures. So this card actually hardly sees any play in Commander, even in Enchantress decks, where it seems so perfect, because turning all of your enchantments into creatures is often a huge downside. Yeah, there's times when it works out and you make all the creatures and you use them to win the game, but more often you just turn all your enchantments, which are normally hard to kill, into creatures, which are very easy to kill, and they all get blown up and you end up really, really sad. Plus in Commander, there's just so many other ways of doing this, right? Like, unless somehow being a creature is an upside for your deck. Going back to where we started with this card, I just want to add 15 power to the battlefield and 3 bodies for 7 mana. Then the card's great. But if you just want to get back all your artifacts and enchantments, I'd rather use Brilliant Restoration, Triumphant Reckoning. Open the Vault's a little risky because your opponents get their stuff back too, but like Replenish, even Wake the Past. There's so many options depending on your deck that basically do what this does, but without what I consider to be a drawback of turning your things into creatures. So Relive the Past. If you think of it as a card that just adds a massive amount of power and bodies to the battlefield, I think it's pretty good in that situation. Just don't think of it as a way to like recur your important artifacts and enchantments, because in that context, the Starfield of Nyx thing, turning them into creatures is actually way more of a drawback than an upside here. In the world of lower rarity cards, there's a couple worth mentioning individually. Chalk Outline is intriguing. 4 mana enchantment. It says whenever one or more creatures leave your graveyard, create a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token token and then investigate. So you make a clue token. So this reminds me of Desecrated Tube. Desecrated Tube never really caught on as a competitive card, but essentially has the same text as Chalk Outline, except it makes a 1/1 flyer and no clue instead of a 2/2 ground creature and a clue. But it's a fun build around effect. We got a lot of ways to have creatures leave the graveyard in Standard. We can collect them for evidence. We have stuff like Graveyard Trespass or various effects that can exile them, Lion Sash. So maybe there's some way to build around this. I wish it was like 1 less mana. 4 is like a little much for this, but it does seem like a cool budget deck to build. We also got Escape Tunnel. So Escape Tunnel, land that can tap and sack itself to search for a basic land, put it into play, tap, then shuffle, or tap and sack itself to give target creature with power 2 or less can't be blocked this turn. It's literally power creep Evolving Wilds or Terramorphic Expanse, which is the good kind of power creep. I think some people hear power creep and automatically think, oh, that's bad. Power creep always bad. This is where we want to see power creep though, right? Like Evolving Wilds Terramorphic Expanse just aren't really good enough to see play anywhere, not in 2024, giving them a little extra juice where if you don't need the land, you can maybe get in some damage by making a creature unblockable. That's the kind of power creep that we want to see. I don't think this really changes much. It's not like Escape Tunnel is so much better than Evolving Wilds. It's going to be like some constructed staple, but it is a nice little step in the right direction towards maybe making these common lands a little bit more useful. We also got Repulsive Mutation, which I'm not sure what to think about this card. So Simic mana, green, blue, and X. For an instant, you put X +1/+1 counters on target creature you control, then counter up to 1 target spell unless its controller pays mana equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. So this is Spell Rupture, except you have the upside of being able to put a bunch of counters on a creature in the late game. I would be surprised if this was a constructed card. It's too risky, right? It's a counter spell that if you don't have a creature, doesn't do anything. So you gotta be a creature heavy deck to even consider it. In the late game, it is kind of nice if you're playing some Simic deck with big bodies. You don't even have to put counters on things. This is probably just 2 mana counter or something. And you have the upside, if you have a ton of mana and nothing else going on, then you can just make one of your creatures huge to try to close out the game. It's also worth mentioning the way this is worded. You can't just play this as a weird janky pump spell. Like, you don't have to have a spell on the stack to cast this. You put the counters on the creature first, and then you can counter something. So worst case, you can just like attack with your team and spend all your mana to put like 5 counters on something and maybe close out the game. So I think this card probably useful in limited, and there could be an outside chance it shows up in constructed. We also got just a ton more lower rarity stuff. Some really cool designs in this set with all the disguise stuff. It's going to make for a really fun limited format, so make sure to check it out over at MTGPreviews.com. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Murders at Karlov Manor spoilers for today. So what do you think? What's your favorite card of the day? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back tomorrow with even more Murders at Karlov Manor spoilers. So until then, have an amazing day, everyone, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, you can check out yesterday's spoiler video here, or maybe the Against the Odds where we tried to combo off with Intruder Alarm in Timeless.